it's Girlscamp. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girlscamp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and today is my Super Bowl, my Roman Empire, if you will, because we get to talk about Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. We just got season 3. I binge watched it. I know a lot of you binge watched it. I love talking about the secret lives of Mormon wives because, number one, I just love reality television generally, but also I am a former Mormon and I love talking about Mormonism. I love talking about the overlap of influencer culture and Mormonism. I like talking about Mormonism specifically as it relates to younger millennials and Gen Z people. And so the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives really is just such great fodder for the types of conversations that I personally love to have. I've said this since season 1 of this show, and I will say it again. It is really hard to wrap my head around as a Utah-born, Mormon-raised, young wife and mother myself, how gigantic this show has become. Watching conversations on a television show this huge about Mormonism is just really kind of mind-blowing because I feel like Mormonism, we got some shout outs here and there when I was growing up in the church, and it was always a big deal if anyone mentioned Mormons, if there was ever a reference about Mormonism. And so to have it really taking center stage in this way is just a crazy thing to witness. I was watching the show on Hulu, and the commercial breaks, there were a couple commercials that I kept being served. One of them was Jen Affleck doing the Dunkin' Donuts commercial. She's a cast member. There was this whole joke because she thought she was maybe distantly related to Ben Affleck, which I think has been since debunked. But her and Ben Affleck are in this giant Dunkin' Donuts commercial together. And there's also an ad for Call of Duty Black Ops 7, I think. Don't know how I remember that. But Layla, Miranda, and Jesse, who are 3 cast members, are in that commercial. And it really just struck me seeing them in the commercial breaks, how big this has gotten, what their level of fame is, because I do watch reality TV, and I feel like it's pretty rare that as you're watching a show on reality TV, you are then seeing those cast members in the commercials for these really big name brands. I'm really happy for these women. I hope they are getting their bag. It seems like they are. It seems like they are working very hard because we've been given a lot of content in a short amount of time. They get a lot of pushback. They get a lot of public opinion, public perception. So I'm happy to see that they are getting bigger and bigger brand deals. If you also love the show and watched it, you are in the right place. If you don't care at all about the show, you are also in the right place because I am going to be, yes, talking about the show, but more so talking about the Mormon dynamics that get brought up in the show, the various dramas and plot points that I think have something to say about Mormon culture, Utah culture at large. So I hope you'll stick around even if you haven't seen the show, and I will be providing context along the way as necessary. The first plot point I want to delve into, which is one of the main plot lines of the whole season, is the affair between Jesse and Jordan. Jesse is one of the main Mom Talk cast members. She's been there since the beginning, and she had what she is calling an affair or an emotional affair. And I think that term could be a little bit up for debate. But what happened is she and her husband, Jordan, were separated. They were facing a lot of problems in their marriage, so they had separated. And while they were separated, she kissed someone twice. This guy's name is Marciano. He's from Vanderpump Villa reality TV world. I don't follow along with any of that, but some of these women, the Mormon wives women, went on Vanderpump Villa last summer or maybe 2 summers ago, Jesse met Marciano. They reconnected. She kissed him twice, and then they texted for a couple of weeks. So she says, yes, we kissed. And then there was also this emotional affair aspect with the texting and some sexting. Though we don't learn about this until later in the season, Jesse eventually reveals that the reason her and Jordan were separated in the first place on that break when she kissed this man was because he had been emotionally abusive to her. This is not the first time we've encountered emotionally abusive men in the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives universe. If you remember Zach Affleck, he's married to Jen Affleck of the Dunkin' Donuts commercial. And in season 1 and 2, there was a lot of really toxic, verbally abusive behavior from him toward his wife. And I talked a lot about how I think that Mormonism can breed that kind of behavior because it's very patriarchal, because men are used to being in control. They are told by the Mormon church that they preside over their wives and their families. And I think it's interesting that we are already seeing this again in a different marriage. I will say Jesse and Jordan are ex-Mormon. So they both grew up in the church and then they both ended up leaving the church. So they are no longer getting the Mormon messaging, but obviously they grew up with that messaging and they are still living in Utah amongst a lot of Mormonism. The thing that stood out to me most about this affair and the fallout is that when Jordan found out his wife had cheated on him, he kept using the word emasculated. He could not stop saying how emasculated it made him feel that he had been cheated on. Even if he didn't say that so many times, like you really couldn't miss it because of how many times he said it, I think that's a weird word to use even one time in reference to an affair. I think it's such a tell that the thing he is most worried about is not his relationship, but is people's perception of him and his own manhood and manliness. He wasn't using words like, I'm so hurt by this, I'm so confused, I feel betrayed, this is putting this relationship that means so much to me at risk, etc., etc. He was more so focused on, oh, how is this going to make me look to everyone else? And this is going to make me look like I am not a man, which is very rooted in toxic masculinity, I think, because it is showing that he sees himself in a relationship with his wife as someone who has ownership, who needs loyalty in order for his own manhood to be legitimate. I also think it was an interesting thing to say because it didn't require any vulnerability from him to really talk about what it felt like to find out his partner had cheated in this way. Instead, it kind of put him at a distance from emotions and vulnerability. And he was just able to say, oh, this is emasculating to me. This is embarrassing to me. It was all this externalized emotion because I think men in general, and maybe particularly men who have been raised in a Mormon culture or other high demand religions, they are trying to maintain this very masculine outward appearance, and vulnerability is usually not part of that picture. When Jordan went to another cast member named Dakota and told him that he had been cheated on and how emasculated he was feeling about it, Dakota said something that I wrote down. He was talking about how, yes, the cheating happened, but also how Jessie in this relationship is the breadwinner. She's the one who makes all the money. Even before she joined Mom Talk, she was a really successful business owner. She owns her own salon. She seems to be doing very, very well for herself and is probably doing even better for herself now that she's on the cast of this show. And so as Jordan was explaining to Dakota how he felt, Dakota said, because Jordan isn't the breadwinner, for a man, that adds another layer of feeling not enough. And I think that's something that is really fascinating to witness as you're seeing these dynamics play out of cheating and talking about divorce or separation. Usually in the traditional patriarchal system, the man in the heterosexual marriage is the breadwinner. And that's pretty much how it is for most Mormons, for a lot of Mormons at least, because that's what's explicitly encouraged in Mormon doctrine. If I need to pull out receipts, I'll just pull out receipts. The family proclamation to the world, which is words from the Mormon prophets, says that men are to preside over the home and women are primarily responsible for the nurture of the children. So it does say that. And because of that and other societal factors, it tends to be the case that people who are Mormon or even people who grew up Mormon are often in that traditional situation where the man is providing. And so to watch this drama unfold, but to have that specific part of it flipped on its head and have Jesse, the one who cheated, be the one who has the financial control really was so interesting to witness, because Jordan had really no leverage in that regard, which oftentimes toxic men use that kind of thing as leverage, like use financial control. And I think it made him extra insecure, as Dakota pointed out, because not only was he cheated on, but he's also not providing for this person. He's not providing financially. And you can see how that adds this extra layer of insecurity. So when the cheating happens, that insecurity, I think, really came out in a very strong way. While I obviously don't condone cheating, and Jessie herself said she wished that she didn't do it, and she apologized many times. She took accountability for it. I also see her behavior really as a cry for help. Once we got to see and heard from her about what she's kind of dealing with Jordan, we see conversations on camera, which I'm always just thinking, if they talk this way to their partner on camera, knowing it's going to be broadcasted literally to the world, I can only imagine what's happening behind closed doors. But there were multiple conversations where Jordan was talking to Jesse about having kissed this man twice and texted him. And he was saying things like, that's disgusting, using language like disgusting. At one point he said, that's why I've treated you the way I've treated you. And then what I think is the worst of all is he used their kids to shame her even further. He said things like, now your son is going to grow up knowing that his mom is a cheater, which is just not a warranted thing to say, I don't think, in any circumstance, and especially in this one. And it became pretty clear that, Jesse was telling the truth, which I believed anyway, that he had been, maybe continues to be emotionally abusive. And so I think her cheating on him, again, though I don't think it's an excuse necessarily, I do think it was a cry for help. I think she was struggling in her marriage, wasn't getting her needs met, was feeling unseen and unappreciated. And so she ended up having this little fling emotional affair. Another quote I pulled from Zach Affleck, the one who had his previous history with his wife, Jen, his own toxic behavior, which I will say, it seems like he has, who knows? I know a lot of people out there aren't buying Zach's redemption arc. It seems like he is at least trying, which, yes, I know the bar is absolutely in hell, and who knows what his motivations are. It seems like he's trying to learn and grow and support his wife, Jen. That's at least kind of what he's showing on TV after the fallout of his behavior in the first season. The second season was kind of him learning, growing. They've been going to therapy, learning how to communicate, things like that. And like I said, I'm sort of with him. And then he'll say and do things that I'm like, I still think you've got a long way to go, buddy. And this is one of those moments in reference to this situation with Jordan and Jesse. When Jesse came out and told the rest of the women were like, well, he shouldn't be emotionally abusive to you, and were really supportive of Jesse, being like, yeah, obviously probably shouldn't have cheated, but you shouldn't be emotionally abused. And they weren't encouraging her to leave him, I would say, at least from what we saw, but they were definitely like, yeah, you should not stand for that, which is great advice, I think. And the men of the group, who now call themselves Dad Talk, were kind of having their own conversations. And amongst Dad Talk, there was more this sentiment of, the women should be supporting Jesse and Jordan together and should be supporting their marriage because that's ultimately the best thing for their family. And Zach said this: I'm all for women empowerment. I just think it's sad that all of these women have families and that's not the number one thing that they're pushing to fight for. I think mom talk could learn a lot from dad talk, honestly. First of all, no. With the mom talk needing to learn from dad talk. Dad talk only exists, and even barely so, and even with far less interest than mom talk because of mom talk. Again, it's using children, not in as cruel a way as Jordan was when he was like, Jesse, your son is going to be so ashamed of you someday, but almost weaponizing children to be like, well, Jesse has to make this work and it's selfish of her to not be focusing on making this work because they have kids. And therefore everyone else in the situation should be encouraging her to work it out with Jordan, regardless of Jordan and his behavior, because there are kids in the mix. And I think that's just really unfair. And I think if someone is being emotionally, verbally, obviously physically abused, that it is not in the best interests of the children to stay with that person just to keep the family together. This is the type of thinking that I think is still really at large in Mormon communities. Divorce is very taboo. There's a lot of pressure to stay together, especially once there are children in the mix. And because marriage in the Mormon faith is taken very seriously. It's a covenant that you make to be with your partner, and you covenant also with God. You are going to be with that person for eternity in the Mormon framework. Yes, Jesse and Jordan are not fully, prescribing to all of those things that the Mormon doctrine teaches, but those are still things that they spent their whole life hearing. And so I do think that it probably still has an impact on how they view divorce. And I just think that it's not okay to use kids, again, as a justification for women staying in toxic situations. It does look like Jesse and Jordan have somewhat reconciled. That's where the season ended, is that they decided they were going to give it another shot. Jesse said Jordan has been going to therapy and working on himself, and that's great. And if they end up being able to work it out and be in a happy marriage, that's great. We will see. Time will tell. Jessie did put her house, the current home she lives in, up for sale. I think like the day the season premiered. So people were speculating, well, maybe they are getting divorced. Maybe they're just moving together. Who knows? I do think that when that level of emotional abuse is present in a marriage, it is a long road ahead of them. Even if Jordan is really set on changing, I do think change is possible. I think growth is possible. I also think it takes a lot of time and often is kind of a slow shift. So I don't know. I'm not saying that I don't have any hope that he can be better, but I do think that it's maybe a long journey ahead, especially with all of those really ingrained beliefs about patriarchy and masculinity. One thing that people are chattering about is the fact that this season particularly really broke the fourth wall in the sense that the women on the show are talking about being on the show. They're talking a lot about contract negotiations. They're talking about who's filming and who's not filming and why. That is just pretty consistently brought up. And I feel like this is kind of a divisive point where a lot of people are like, I don't want to be watching a show about the show. Why are they breaking that fourth wall? It's too self-referential, which I can understand to an extent. I personally really love that they are talking so openly about the show because it feels so honest. It feels so real. It feels like that's actually what they're thinking about and dealing with and working through, especially because they are filming this show so much. Oftentimes shows have a much bigger break in between filming, but this really is kind of the bulk of their lives right now is filming this show and figuring out, what makes it worth it to do, who's going to be on it with them, and how they navigate all of that. I also think that it helps the whole mom talk thing because these women are in a group called Mom Talk, which, as far as we, the viewer, can tell, is essentially a group of women who do TikToks together. At its most reductive, they do TikToks together and they kind of help each other to get brand deals and to be a thing. You know, they're more powerful together as Mom Talk than they are apart. And I think by breaking the fourth wall and talking more about the show, Mom Talk now also serves as a sort of shorthand for being a cast member on this show. And obviously, being a cast member on the show comes with money, comes with opportunities. And so now when they're having these meetings of like, let's all get together and decide if we're going to let so-and-so back into Mom Talk and take a vote on it. Although I do think that's still maybe a somewhat juvenile approach, and I think is probably very much driven by producers to be doing it that particular way. I actually think it makes sense to an extent because it's basically them deciding, are we going to continue doing business with this person? They really are treating it like a business, and they're treating being on reality TV like a business, which ultimately it is. And yes, maybe as a viewer, sometimes we don't want to remember that the people we're watching are just like, this is their work to an extent. But to me, it makes it even more fascinating because we're being let in on the behind the scenes of it all. And because we're seeing these Mormon, ex-Mormon women in their 30s, in their 20s. I forget how young some of them are. Most of them are in their 20s still, with young children navigating business decisions. And in the context of the Mormon framework, that is somewhat radical, is maybe a strong word for it, but that is outside of the norm to see women, especially young women who are in years where they have young children, really navigating business. The business side of things leads me to one of the plot points around a member of Mom Talk. Well, has she been officially inducted back in? I don't think she has yet. Someone who's kind of in and out of Mom Talk, Whitney Levitt. Whitney was the villain of season 1. She kind of spent season 2 like a little bit in and out, trying to make her way back in. And then in season 3, she actually decided to take a break from filming the show. And they talk about that on the show. They're like, Whitney has chosen to leave Mom Talk, aka she is no longer filming the show. And then about halfway through the season, Whitney pops back up and she says, she admits to the cameras, I came back because I was told that if I come back and film for the remainder of the season, that I have a chance to be on Dancing with the Stars. And that has been a long-term dream and goal of hers. She's a dancer. She did dance in college. She's a dance major, and she's always wanted to be on Dancing with the Stars. Now, the girls did not like this. The other women, of Mom Talk didn't like this because they're like, you can't just come in and out and, you shouldn't just be here for these types of opportunities. You should be here for the sisterhood of Mom Talk. I know some people think the sisterhood and the friendship side is completely made up and they're all just cast members that are there because they've been casted to be. I obviously am not naive enough to think that these women are BFFs in real life. We see on our TVs, many of them don't even get along. However, I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that they are, co-workers at the very least. And it makes sense that you want to get along with or be able to be in the same room with the people that are your coworkers. And I also think some of them are actually good friends. So I've seen some people say like, Whitney, they're all just here for business, which yes, ultimately at its core, I think that's true. I also think there is something to be said about like, hey, I want to be doing business with people who are also who like me and who I like. So there's this kind of constant like dichotomy of like, yes, business, but also yes, friendship. And Whitney came in and said, I am here because I want to audition for Dancing with the Stars and I have to be here. So the women of the show didn't like that. And it appears that the public also did not like that very much. And yes, I just made a whole point about the sisterhood, but I will say ultimately good for Whitney for being honest and for just saying like, this is why I came back on the show. I think that's way better than her pretending like all of a sudden I'm just missing my Mom Talkers and just saying what the reality was, which is like, no, I got enticed to come back by this other opportunity. as I was watching, I was like, okay, I get it. And I think it's kind of cool that she's just being honest about it. And I also was like, oh no, I feel like people aren't going to like this. And I feel like it's going to probably affect what's going on Dancing with the Stars, because Dancing with the Stars is happening right now. Whitney has had a really phenomenal season on the show. I think she's objectively the best dancer left. And last night, from when I'm recording this, was the Dancing with the Stars semifinal, and Whitney was voted off the show. And I just don't think it's a coincidence that the very next show after the season of Secret Lives of Mormon Wives was released, Whitney ended up not making it through to the next round. And I think it's because people don't like her on the show. And I think even more so because people are like, well, this is stupid that she just came back on the show to be on Dancing with the Stars. And they like sort of wanted to punish her. Obviously, we don't know everyone who voted for other people and not Whitney and why, but it seems like they have to be at least connected. And I think it's really devastating that she was almost punished in that way. I don't think she should have been punished in that way by the public anyway. I think people really hold past sins against her, which is their prerogative. I say, let this woman have a second chance, let her live. I don't think anything she's done in the past is like so bad. And I think other public figures, even people on the cast, have been forgiven for worse. I think what's extra sad about it is that if you watch the entirety of the season, Whitney ends up actually coming back around and reconciling and apologizing with the rest of the women. And she seems to do so sincerely, I think. It seems to me that when she said, I'm only here for this opportunity, it was a defense mechanism because she didn't want to be left out again. She almost wanted to be like, it's okay, I don't care, I don't want to be your friend, because she didn't want to put herself in a vulnerable position to become the villain and the person in the cast that nobody liked, which is kind of her history on the show. I think that's why she did it. And then I think as she was back filming and with these women, she realized, I really do care about these women. I really do have friendships with these women. And her friendships with the women actually go way back before the show even started filming. Like, I think she genuinely has been good friends with a lot of these people. So I just think it's really sad that the outcome of all of that was her getting what I think is prematurely getting kicked off of Dancing with the Stars. I was so excited to see her in the final episode. Whatever you think about her, she is an entertainer, and I think she's so fun to watch. There was a moment in Dancing with the Stars where Derek Huff, who also happens to be ex-Mormon, I mean, I guess Whitney's active Mormon from what we can tell, but Derek Huff tells her, because she says in Dancing with the Stars, in like the package before the dance, she says, this has really changed my life being on the show, because I've always wanted to be an entertainer. And I thought once I had kids, I kind of had given up on that dream. I didn't think I would be able to be an entertainer and a performer in this way. And this show gave her the opportunity to realize that that's still possible for her, which I think is so beautiful and such an important message to any women who have children, but especially to Mormon women who get married young and have children young. So oftentimes their dreams are snuffed before they can even begin. It's a really powerful message for her to be like, this is possible. I can be a mom and I can achieve my goals of performing. And after her last dance, which was beautiful, a Viennese waltz, if I remember correctly, Derek Huff said to her, I really admire your willingness to say what you want and to really go for it. And a lot of people are afraid to do that because then they're afraid to fail when they've told everyone what their dreams are. And he just said, I think that's really brave. And she was like tired from her dance and she had tears streaming down her face. And I literally started crying because I was like, yes, that is so powerful. It was inspiring. I'm inspired by her, truly. I'm inspired by her because it makes me feel like, as a 30-something-year-old mom of 2 children, there is still so much room for me to achieve my dreams and achieve my goals in a society that doesn't always think that, and especially in a culture that definitely doesn't think that, and even sometimes punishes women for wanting to have dreams and goals outside of their families. especially in those younger child rearing years. So I'm fully Team Whitney, if you can't tell, and I just wish her the best. I hope that she's able to pivot into being a performer. I feel like that's what she really wants. And I kind of just feel like she maybe doesn't really fully jive with the rest of the women. I think she does with some of them. I think it's just a hard group dynamic for her, and I'm not saying she's handled everything correctly, but that's my opinion on Whitney Levitt. The one thing that does have me scratching my head about Whitney, and we'll have to put a pin in this, but is her friendship with Demi Ingeman, who is kind of the new villain, I guess, of the show since season 2, and certainly was so in season 3. I'm confused why Whitney is still somehow vouching for her, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. On to the next topic, and my favorite one, reckoning with faith. We didn't get a full storyline about a faith crisis, which I did have my fingers crossed for, because in the promos for this season, we saw some glimpses of Jen Affleck and of Layla Taylor kind of mentioning like things they weren't feeling great about with the church, kind of little hints that maybe there was some faith questioning at play. I was hoping that would be a major storyline. It wasn't, but we did get some really interesting glimpses into what some of these women are dealing with when it comes to how they relate to their own Mormon identity. I really do hope somewhere down the line of the show that they choose to make a faith crisis a main storyline and like really get into what those conversations would be like with people's partner, even with their family members, especially if they're active Mormon. I think that's something that the general public would find very fascinating, that ex-Mormons who have gone through faith crises and come out the other side would find very cathartic. And I think it's something that this show could do uniquely well, especially because we've seen these women, like we're seeing these women through a journey. We now know a lot about their lives. And so to chronicle a faith crisis and maybe even leaving the church, I think would be very fascinating. But obviously, I'm biased. We got to see the most faith stuff from Layla. And Layla is a biracial Black woman. And she talked a little bit more this season about what it is like not only being Mormon, being raised Mormon and Black, but also being raised in Utah. There's a point in the season where she says that there is a scripture in the Book of Mormon that says that people in the Book of Mormon were cursed with a skin of blackness. I want to read that scripture to you. But I will say before we get there that Layla mentions that. She says, I didn't know this when I was converted to the church. I later found out. It's very troubling. And then very quickly she says, and the church has denounced that's not really what they think. And, then she kind of moves on. Who knows how much she really talked about it, how much of that was an edit. I also was wondering, especially in that moment, if the producers are maybe trying to toe a line with like the Mormon church official or with members of the church watching, because I'm sure a lot of the audience, at least some portion of the audience is active Mormon. It feels like they're kind of like bringing up issues, yes, but then very quickly being like, but it's okay though, or it's like not that big of a deal though. Maybe that's just how Layla actually feels at this point. I'm not sure, but I wanted to give a little context for those who don't know to what Layla's talking about here. There's a scripture, this is in the Book of Mormon, so the Mormon book of scripture added to the Bible. It's in a book called 2 Nephi, chapter 5, verse 21, and it says, and he being God, and he had caused the cursing to come upon them, yea, even a sore cursing because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. A little more background on that scripture is there's two main groups of people in the Book of Mormon, the Nephites and the Lamanites. They descend from one family. The Lamanites start being wicked according to God, the Mormon God. And because of their wickedness, he gives them this skin of blackness so that the good people, the Nephites, will like know who's good and who's bad, essentially. Not good. Very much not good. Obviously, cause for concern, very problematic. I did research if the church has ever come out and like really apologized for this or renounced this. There is a manual called Come Follow Me. And this is what like active Mormons right now teach from. So if they're like teaching the Book of Mormon and they get to this point in the Book of Mormon, this is what the manual says about this specific passage. The Lamanites remained in the land and rebelled against the Lord. They were cut off from his presence. The curse mentioned in this chapter was separation from God. The changing of the Lamanites' skin was a mark or a sign of the curse. The nature of this mark is not fully understood. The mark initially distinguished the Lamanites from the Nephites. Later, as both the Nephites and Lamanites each went through periods of wickedness and righteousness, the mark became irrelevant as an indicator of the Lamanites standing before God. So the way they're kind of trying to work around this is be like, no, the actual changing of the skin color was not a curse. It was a sign of the curse. The curse was separation from God. And then there needed, I guess, to be this physical sign. We don't fully understand why, but that sign happened to be darker or black skin. Weak argument and not what I think it should be, which is just an apology and editing the scriptures, which they can't really do because then it would be admitting that there was fault in these scriptures that they think come directly from God, that it's a divine book. They've painted themselves into a corner with this one. But I did just want to point out that, yes, the church is not teaching explicitly that people who have darker skin or black skin are cursed from God. But I mean, you do the math, right? That is essentially what Mormons still think is the origin of different skin colors in this way. And when God chose to make a sign of the curse, it was darker skin. We also see Layla reckoning with her biracial identity outside of just the context of Mormonism. There's this side plot where Layla is struggling with her hair because she goes to Jesse, another cast member who owns a salon, and she gets extensions there. And it's just not very healthy for her hair. So she ends up deciding to go to a black hairdresser and getting a new type of extensions. I really loved this whole sequence because we see Layla talking to this woman. They're kind of able to talk about what it's like to live in Utah, what it was like for Layla to grow up in Utah. She just seems like it's really healing and helpful for her to talk to this woman. But then she's very scared that she's going to have to tell her friend Jessie, like, I switched hairstylists, which is actually a thing. I get it. I feel like there's a loyalty to a hairstylist. You don't want to act like you don't like them and what they do, whatever. So she sees Jessie. Jessie notices her hair looks different, and Layla tells her, hey, I decided to go to someone who works with black hair. I felt like that would be important. You know, my hair was suffering, whatever. And I really loved how Jessie responded. I thought it was a really sweet moment because she was like, you can just tell me next time. And I'm happy for you. And I would love to learn more about working with black hair and with ethnic hair. And she actually like looks at Layla's extensions and just like responds with a lot of curiosity and support, which I think was really lovely. Another thing I appreciated Layla calling out is in episode 10, Taylor, Frankie Paul, our main girl, wants to give a baby blessing to her baby that she has with her baby daddy, Dakota. So they're not married. At this point in the season, they're on the outs. And so Dakota has not given his blessing for the baby to be blessed. They were going to do it together, but now they're on bad terms. And because of that, it ends up being that they kind of have this blessing party, but Taylor's dad just gives the baby like a generic blessing. In Mormonism, there's like an official blessing that you give a baby, which is to be like, they're a member of the church. This is the name that they'll be known by on church records. And then there's just a generic blessing that follows of like, you know, hopes and dreams for their future, etc. And because Dakota hasn't sanctioned that, it's just a generic blessing, not the official baby blessing. And I really appreciated Layla calling this out. She was like, yeah, it's weird that Taylor's dad has to give a blessing and that Taylor herself, the mother of this child, can't do it. which there's not much more to say about it than that. But I do find it weird that if the priesthood holding man is unwilling to show up, then the next best option is the next best man who's closest to the kid. And Taylor herself really can't participate in a baby blessing in any real significant way at all. Another Mormon conversation that stood out to me was they go together on a trip. They're in St. George, and a number of the women are standing outside and they see the St. George temple. So they kind of start talking about the temple, and we find out that Macy, one of the cast members, Macy, has an active temple recommend. And for those who don't know, that is kind of like the ultimate sign that you are a fully participating devout member of the church. Because in order to get that, you have to go to your bishop and tell them that you are living the Mormon way, that you're keeping the word of wisdom, no coffee, no alcohol, that you are wearing your garments day and night. And Macy says she has a temple recommend, which is interesting because Macy also openly drinks coffee and pretty clearly does not wear her garments. So maybe she's just not telling her bishop that. Maybe her bishop is okay with that. Some bishops are, some bishops aren't. But if we are looking at it in the black and white way that I think the church wants it to be, she probably shouldn't technically qualify for a temple recommend, but she has one. So make of that what you will. Taylor is kind of surprised when Macy's like, oh no, yeah, I have an active temple recommend. They're like, oh, interesting. And it kind of kicks off this conversation where Taylor says that her younger sister is currently dating someone who's never been Mormon. And it really has opened Taylor's eyes because it's a great person. Surprise, surprise, even though they aren't Mormon. And Layla says, I wrote this down, she says, you can still be a good person and not be a member. To which Macy responds, the temple recommend holder, I think somewhat defensively. And she's like, oh yeah, well, I grew up in California. And so I know that. I know that you don't have to be a Mormon to be a good person because I grew up around all sorts of people that were great people, even though they're not Mormon. This is always an interesting conversation to have yourself if you are Mormon or ex-Mormon, or to witness, because there's this just elephant in the room where Mormonism teaches that the best thing to be is Mormon, and that if you want to make it to heaven, you've got to be Mormon, and that Mormonism is the one true way. That's what it teaches. And so when people like Layla are like, oh, well, you don't have to be Mormon to be a good person, and Macy's like, well, of course not. I don't think active Mormons think you have to be Mormon to be a good person, but there's a little bit, at least, of a cognitive dissonance, which is that ultimately, in order to reap all the benefits of God in the Mormon framework, you do have to be Mormon. And I just found it interesting to watch Macy kind of play this role of a progressive Mormon who isn't keeping all of the rules herself, who thinks of herself, it seems, as someone who's no, Mormonism isn't the only way, but yet is still holding on enough to Mormonism and maybe not realizing, or maybe just refusing to see that there is some friction between what she thinks and what Mormonism actually officially teaches. They then continue talking, and Taylor is talking about how when dating Mormon men, they will say, we can't do this, this, and this, but we can have sex. And then Layla says, that was literally my ex to a T, just highlighting how not all, but a lot of Mormon men, it seems, according to Taylor and Layla, they will judge you for maybe drinking coffee or alcohol or not wearing garments, but then want to have sex, which is actually a way worse sin in the Mormon hierarchy of sins. And it's just hypocrisy at its finest when men want these women to break the rules if it benefits them, but then they want them to appear like good Mormon women to everyone else. And Macy gets defensive again. It cuts to Macy and she's like, well, not all Mormon men are that way. They're just dating the wrong ones. And, look at my husband. He's a great Mormon man, which is great. And I'm not saying every Mormon man is that way. I'm also saying, I think for Macy, it may behoove her to just be like, oh, that sucks. And yeah, there can be hypocrisy in this kind of rigid patriarchal system. And I understand that, as opposed to being like, well, my husband's not that way, so you're just picking them wrong. The show makes a big deal out of a pride event that happens in Utah, because at the time, Utah had just banned pride flags, which is insane. Yes, we are living in hell over here. Okay, not really, but like, come on, banning pride flags is crazy. And in response to that ban, there's this pride event that the cast is involved in. And this kind of becomes Macy's thing. And she's talking about pride and how supportive she is. And she even says, "We do not stand," speaking of her and her husband, "with the church's stance on the LGBTQ community." She also talks about having a cousin. Well, her husband Jacob has a cousin who just came out as gay. He comes to this event with them. And it's sort of this thing of like Macy being like, "No, I'm an ally. And even though I'm an active member, I don't agree with what the church says about gay people, which is they can't get married in the temple. They can't act on their," how does the church word it? Some insane way of like, you can have feelings of same-sex attraction, but you can't act on them or else you will be punished. You cannot attend the temple, for example. You cannot participate fully if you are engaging or acting on those feelings. You're allowed to have them. You're not allowed to do anything about it. So good for Macy for being like, I don't think that way. And I don't think that's right. Again, we're seeing kind of this friction between what the church says, what it actually demands of its members, and what Macy believes, even though she is very actively attending and part of the church. And this whole progressive Mormon thing, it's a thing. It's good in a lot of ways. And I also think it's bad in a lot of ways. I think it's good in the sense that, at least she's not like, well, the church says no to gay people, so I don't think gay people should be allowed to live their lives. And I also think it's complicated because she is still supporting an organization that does cause a lot of harm. The LGBTQ youth suicide rates in Utah are very high. It's a very real problem, as you can imagine, when gay youth are learning that it's a sin to be who they are. And so I always struggle with that a little bit. And I'm not the person who can say yes or no. If you can be an ally and be a member of the Mormon church and be paying tithing to it, etc., I don't feel like that's my decision to make, but I definitely think it's complicated at best. And I always, with Macy, want to just be like, let's just like interrogate that a little further, or like think about that just a little deeper. She obviously gets to do what she wants to do. And I do admire that she's pushing against the grain. I just wish she would push a little harder. I also wondered with this whole Pride event, if the show, and I talked about this a bit with Layla, talking about the like curse of blackness. It feels like the show is towing this line with Mormonism where, yes, they're bringing up issues, but they're trying to be very polite about it. I don't know if that's producer driven. I don't know if that's just to keep the peace among the women, because obviously there's like various perspectives on the Mormon faith amongst the group of women. I interviewed Jessie. I'll link the interview in the show notes, and she's ex-Mormon. She like fully doesn't agree with the church on pretty much anything, but she's also, really good friends with, actively engaging in business and friendship with people who are active Mormon, like Macy. So I don't know if the show is just like not wanting to touch that, which feels a bit weird to me, because that feels like such a central part of what being a Mormon wife or an ex-Mormon wife would entail, is like handling these faith conversations when they don't all agree. And they obviously allow that to happen to some extent, but I don't know. I'd love to see them really get into it and have someone be like, okay, well, if you support gay people, then why do you pay your tithing to the church that was I think the biggest donor to Prop 8, trying to get gay people to not be able to get married, like just a little more push on that, even from the producers, I think would be really interesting. But they just seem to kind of avoid that. And I don't know why. And I don't know if we'll get more of that or if that's just like not something they want to touch. There's also a moment where Jen, who ends up going on Dancing with the Stars. So Jen Affleck and Whitney went on Dancing with the Stars, but she has a conversation with Ezra Souza, who is a pro on Dancing with the Stars. I also just did an episode on this that I will link, but I talked about why seemingly everyone on Dancing with the Stars is Mormon. Not everyone, but a lot of them are Mormon. A lot of them are Utah people. A lot of them have since left the church. Some of them have stayed, which I think would be a really interesting dynamic as well. But Ezra and Jen have this conversation about the church because Jen is like practicing a dance with him before she auditions for Dancing with the Stars. And I found this conversation so interesting. Ezra, I want so bad on Girls Camp. That is like my dream person to interview in this upcoming year. I'm going to reach out to him when he's done with this season of Dancing with the Stars. I just love him. I love him on the show. And he, not a ton, but he seems like he's somewhat open about his journey leaving the church. And he's talking to Jen, and she's kind of saying like, yeah, I kind of had a bit of a faith crisis when the show came out, and, you know, she's just been through these big life changes with people suddenly invested in her life. She's had a lot of personal hardship with her marriage and getting pregnant unexpectedly with her third child. And Ezra is like, yeah, you know, I grew up in the church and I'm gay. And that was really, really hard. And when my parents found out that I was gay, they took me out of dance because they thought dance was making me gay. And it just caused so much turmoil for him that he was like, I left the church. And then he's like, once I really explained to them what this was like, my family ended up leaving the church as well to support me. And Jen's like, yeah, you know, I kind of just, essentially she says, I kind of just take the good and leave the bad. And that's where the conversation ended. I wish they worked in that tension a little bit more. I wish they kept talking, because for someone like Ezra, who's like, no, this church really hurt me. And when my family realized the extent of the hurt, they left with me in solidarity. And Jen seems supportive of him, and it seems like a friendly conversation. And I'm projecting my own shit onto this at this point. I think they handled it well, and, you know, live and let live. But I do feel like Ezra might have been like, so why are you still there then? Like, but you're still supporting it, though, even though it caused all this harm to him. Speaking of unorthodox approaches to Mormonism, our poster girl, Taylor Frankie Paul, at the very beginning of the season, this is like 5 minutes into the first episode, we get this quote from Taylor where she says, "When it comes to church, I only go for like the foundations of it, like love, family, service, and I like going. But I like to go when I want to go. It's like a personal thing for me. And I know a lot of people can't live in the gray, but for me, I can." So that's Taylor's manifesto, it seems, on how she relates to Mormonism. Is she seems to essentially be saying, I don't care all that much about Mormonism, but it is my faith tradition. So if I want to go worship and feel connected to God, that's the place I'm going to go. But I only go if I want to. As with Macy, I'm of two minds here. For some reason, it feels a little different when Taylor says it, because I think Taylor is being more upfront, at least, with like, she knows she doesn't keep the rules. She knows she's not really taking it literally. She's kind of just like, if I want to go, I go. If I'm in the mood for church, I'm going to go to a Mormon church. Whereas Macy is more occupying this space of like, it feels like she thinks Mormonism is true and is just like allowing a lot of cognitive dissonance to happen, because she does seem like she does seem like a literal believer, but who has found these like kind of thought loopholes to make it work so she can drink coffee and not wear her garments or whatever. Whereas Taylor's kind of just like, I don't care that much. And also she obviously doesn't care enough to like separate herself from Mormonism, which I do think she probably should. And I hope eventually she does, because in my mind and from where I sit, it's like, I think the Mormon church is not healthy for anyone. I think, well, do I really feel that way? Yeah. I mean, I think that especially for women, I still think that when they're going to church, it's still a very patriarchal system. It's still racist and homophobic. And so, yeah, I don't think that people should still be supporting the church. Do I think it has benefits for people? Yes. And I guess I'm just not trying to say like, I think it's the best thing for everyone in the world to leave the church, because I don't know everyone in the world and I don't know every individual circumstance. I do hope for these women that they continue to detach from it, because I think it will only serve them to do so. But it is really interesting to have this character, this huge character on TV be like, yeah, I'm Mormon, but I also don't really care about it, because that's very new in the Mormon world. That's very new on the spectrum of Mormonism, because the Mormon church tries really hard to make it so that if you want to participate, you have to fully participate. So Taylor, she doesn't have a temple recommend. She wouldn't be able to go to the temple because she's still actively having sex outside of marriage. She's not keeping the rules. She drinks, all those things, and she doesn't seem to care. The main storyline with Taylor this season is her on-again, off-again relationship with her baby daddy, Dakota. And as I was watching, I wanted to scream at my television, let's get you out of Utah, babe, because the fact that you're so hung up on this man, Dakota, is just not making sense to me. The only sense I can make of it is that it must be slim pickings for what you're looking for. They obviously have a history and they have a kid together. Like, I get it. I really hope that her going on The Bachelorette, because she's currently filming as The Bachelorette, we'll get to see that season in March. I think it comes out. Obviously, there's like concerns about mental health with a show like that. I think it can be very damaging and hard. I almost feel like she's so used to reality TV. She's so used to her life being out there. I really hope this show is good for her, if even just for her to have exposure to men outside of the Mormon church and realize that there's a whole world out there of men that don't have these same toxic traits that I personally believe are, if not created by, at least exacerbated by the Mormon culture. I think Dakota, maybe not so bad as Jordan or Zach that we've discussed, these other dads. I think he does have insecurity around how Taylor is such a breadwinner. She makes a lot of money. She has a lot of influence. She has a lot of fame. And it seems like that makes him insecure as well. And I hope she can just find someone who is not that way. And we'll see. I don't have the highest hopes because, these type of shows, especially for men, I think it's sometimes tricky to like cast men with good, real intentions, but only time will tell. Taylor puts what she claims is the true final nail in the coffin of her relationship with Dakota, because he was entertaining flirty text messages, including a photo from her mom's friend, a very close family friend. A 50-something-year-old woman. Dakota is, 30-something, like maybe 30. And I hope this is the final straw. And I don't have that much more to say about that whole thing besides, like, why are these women all throwing themselves at Dakota? Like, I just don't get it. I don't. But be that as it may, the silver lining of that might be that Taylor might actually officially be done with him. And dear God, I hope that that is true. Another moment I clocked from Taylor when Jessie is managing the fallout from this emotional fling that she had outside of her marriage. Taylor says, "We are raised in the LDS culture of shame on you, but I don't think we deserve to be punished and condemned forever because of our mistakes." And I think that's something the show really highlights throughout all of these storylines is these women make mistakes or their partners make mistakes. They're like going through life things on TV and they're talking about how, yes, there's shame anyway. If you cheat, there's shame from society. But growing up in an LDS context and still living within that culture to a large extent does add a layer of shame. There's an additional layer of guilt and shame that it creates for people. And I think Taylor's become really good at seeing that for what it is and calling it out and being like, yes, there's such a thing as accountability. There's such a thing as learning and growing. And then there's this thing, which is society and Mormonism and Mormons want to shame you beyond that for mistakes that you've made. And she's just not buying into it anymore. And I hope that she's a good support for Jessie as she's like navigating the mistake that she made and that added layer of shame from all of those things. And I think a lot of the women really do push back. There's all the jokes about like, are they really breaking the patriarchy? No, I don't think they are. But I do think they are pushing back in meaningful ways against patriarchy, against Mormonism, against the hyper-Orthodox, hyper-devout form of Mormonism, which does have its pros and cons, but ultimately I hope is something that pushes more progress in the church, or at least causes people to like really reckon with and consider the cognitive dissonance that it requires to stay a member of the church and be a woman who wants to be treated as equal, who wants to work outside the home, because it inevitably will create some dissonance if that's the type of woman that you are. There's a storyline about one of the cast members named Michaela and her husband Jace, and it's about their intimacy issues because Michaela was sexually abused as a child. And it's obviously so awful, and I cannot relate on that front. So I don't mean to share my experience now as a comparison point because I am not comparing. I think it's very brave and very vulnerable of her to be sharing about this on TV, and I hope it is helpful in her healing and not harmful, getting outside perspectives. But I do think talking about intimacy issues is very relevant in a show about Mormon wives. I think it's incredibly relevant because sex issues are very, very rampant in Mormon couples because they get married young, oftentimes without any sexual experience. Or if they have had sexual experience, it's been steeped in a lot of shame and a lot of naivete. A lot of Mormon women especially get taken advantage of sexually because of the naivete around sex, because of how taboo it is, because these high demand religions and purity cultures make women more vulnerable. I had a boyfriend in high school and I was not sexually assaulted, but I do think I was taken advantage of sexually. And in large part, looking back, it's because of how little knowledge I had. Like I didn't even really know what was happening, which made me even less equipped to push back against it. And I think that I still have sexual hangups because of that. And again, not to compare, but I'm just trying to paint a picture here of how and why I think there are intimacy issues for Mormon and even ex-Mormon couples. And this, like I said, is a journey I'm on. I actually had vaginismus, which is essentially when you have pain with penetrative sex, and it's a mental thing. Well, it's physical, but because of your brain won't allow your pelvic floor muscles to relax, which causes a lot of pain with sex. And I was able to finally address that after like 6 years of my marriage. I had kids, my twin girls, and then I was still having pain with sex. It actually got worse. I was kind of used to it at that point. I had multiple doctors in Utah tell me like, it is what it is. Sometimes it's painful. Finally, after having my twin daughters, sex was really excruciating. I also had a pretty traumatic childbirth. I went to physical therapy and I was able to kind of heal that mind-body connection. I know a lot of women have a much tougher journey with it, with healing that. There's also vulvodynia, which is similar, but it's a nerve ending thing where there's pain with sex through the nerve endings of the vulva. And these things are just pretty common. And the reason I bring this up here is because there are so many layers to why I feel like intimacy issues would be present in a young Mormon couple. One thing I don't feel like they really addressed with Jace and Michaela, but feels like so obvious, is that Michaela is pregnant and she has multiple kids. She has been pregnant and postpartum for such a significant portion of their marriage, and that just affects a sex drive so significantly. It affects how a woman feels in their body, about their sexuality. That was a whole journey for me. Even postpartum, the vaginismus aside, was just like, you're almost, you have a new body. And so it felt like that was something that maybe they addressed off camera, but I was like, man, that's another factor to all of this. And that's another factor that these Mormon/ex-Mormon couples face because they got married so young and had kids so young, where most people aren't dealing with like postpartum sex stuff until much later in their lives and also maybe probably in their marriages. And so I think that's just a topic that could continue to be explored because of how present it is and how layered it is because of these Utah Mormon cultural elements. The last plot point that I actually am not even going to really get all that much into because it's very complicated and very nuanced is the Demi stuff with the sexual assault that she alleges happened with Marciano. I will just say, I believe women. I think we should believe women. I think it's awful that he touched her without her consent. She claims he grabbed her butt, I think, without her consent. And that's awful. And that should not have happened, period. End of story. That is something I think and believe. And I also think Demi showed up in some really unflattering ways this season, in the way that she speaks to people, in the way that she engages with people. I just am not a fan of her or her behavior. And I think both of those things can exist at once. I am surprised that the show got so deep into the sexual assault allegations because of how delicate it is and because of how triggering, obviously, that is for people and how sensitive it is. And I feel like because that happened to Demi, there were things that she said that maybe she felt emboldened to say, like comparing that to, at one point she says, yeah, because people were like, well, then why were you texting Marciano? Because she said that happened. And then she was still like very actively texting him, very friendly messages, even some sexual messages. She was talking to him about her daughter. She sent a video of her daughter to him. Her husband sent him a DoorDash meal because he said he felt bad for him. So people were confused, which I think is fair. People were a bit confused. And in her explanation of those things, she made some comparisons that I think are very, very problematic. She said, well, why does a woman go back to her husband after he beat her like 60 times or something like that? Comparing her situation in ways that I don't think it should be compared. And I think showing actually an insensitivity and a misunderstanding for what people in situations of domestic violence go through, people who have experienced even more severe forms of sexual assault. I just think she's in very tricky territory, and I feel like I'm even in tricky territory talking about it because of those reasons I said. Like, that doesn't feel like reality TV fodder for me. It's just like, it's not, I'm just surprised they went there when it is so sensitive to people. And so that's all I'll say on that matter. And yeah, I don't know how we just got a little teaser for the reunion, and it sounds like that comes up. This clip was taken out of context, but it sounds like Demi says to Macy, whose book I just read, who was chased with scissors by her ex-boyfriend who was drugged and assaulted. And Demi says to Macy, yeah, I know you got slapped or whatever. Like, seems to be diminishing Macy's experiences, which is just really shitty, really not okay. We don't have the full context of that yet, but we will see how that unfolds. I could keep talking forever and ever and ever about the secret lives of Mormon wives. Maybe we will again in the future after the reunion. I don't know, but thanks for being here with me as we unpack all of this and talk about the Mormonism stuff, talk about the patriarchy stuff. There really is just so much there, and can't wait for season 4. They are pumping them out. So probably in 6 months, I will see you here again to talk about it. I have talked to one of the cast members that I am going to be interviewing very likely in January. And yeah, I can't wait to talk to you next week. If you're wanting more Girls Camp, in the meantime, I'm actually taking a break off of socials, but let's see. I think I'll be back on at the end of this week when this goes live. So you can follow along. Haley Rawl on TikTok, Girls Camp Podcast on YouTube, on Instagram. And if you want even more content, I do 2 bonus episodes per month on the Patreon. You can find that at patreon.com/girlscamp. Would love to have you join us there. Talk soon. Bye.
GIR